Oh, it's past due for another episode of Stan the History Man. And today I want to talk about the American Railroad. The American Railroad, which was the builder of this country, basically, and that's not an exaggeration. It first comes from the steam engine, which was invented pretty much by the British. The Newcomen steam engines that were so inefficient they had to build them only around the coal mine because it burned so much coal that they couldn't afford to transport it. But gradually, in England, the engines became more efficient and were first put on ships and then on moving vehicles, that is, railroads. And the first railroad was the Liverpool and Manchester, or the Manchester and Darlington, different names for it, in 1829. And the United States followed soon after with the Baltimore and Ohio. And right from the start, you can see the difference between American and British and European railroads. The British railroads went from one city to another, one developed area to another. And so it was a relatively short distance between Liverpool and Manchester, same area of the country. So it could be fenced off efficiently, keep people off, animals and everything off the rails. We couldn't do that. We had signs like no trespassing. That's right. We could never stop people, from cattle especially, from wandering all over the track, and little boys getting their pennies crushed on the track and so on by the trains. So that was a big difference. Also, the cow catcher. You'll notice, you look at British or European railroads, there are no cow catcher. What happens? Because of the fencing, because these railroads are fenced off, so they don't, how's a cow going to get through? So it's very rare. Whereas this country, we have all the, not only open spaces between alongside the tracks, but level crossings, where people are getting killed. Every year, I put several hundred are killed on railroad crossings, trying to beat the trains, or on double track, not seeing the trains coming from the other direction. So a lot of basic differences there. I think the most important is that European railroads were going from one developed area to another. American railroads were going from one area to an undeveloped area, and their idea was to develop that area, which is basically what happened. We like to say that, well, in the old days, the government didn't give money to businesses. Yes, they did, the railroads. They had it after the Civil War, a deal whereby um, every other section, like a checkerboard of a geographical section of government land, would be allotted to the railroads on condition they build a railroad through it. So that way, they got that land for free, and then they developed it, and then they made money on it. So it developed this country, especially out west. And what it did also, it reoriented this country in the colonial period and right up through the 1820s, 30s. We were primarily up against Eastern Seaboard in cities. Do you realize that in 1776, that is the year of the Revolution, Philadelphia was the second largest city in the British Empire? So you mustn't think of the colonialists as just a bunch of buckskin-clad characters, out in the woods or the fields or something. No, very much orientated towards commerce, that is, cities, ports. Okay. In fact, the only American city of any size before the American Revolution, or during the Revolution, that matter, was York, Pennsylvania, the center of agriculture and so on. But Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Charleston, Savannah, these were the cities where probably a majority of Americans lived at that time. So with the railroads, then we're reoriented. We look towards the west, the Midwest, and then the forest. And another thing that happened, although our maritime commerce boomed at this time, after the Civil War, the westward thrust was so strong that we basically gave up to where we are today, in a weird situation of the biggest navy in the world, like one aircraft carrier. Our navy could probably wipe out, practically every other one. Uh, and yet we don't have a single, as far as I can see, a single ton of unsubsidized merchandise going on an American freighter. That's weird, okay? But a lot of people don't know that. Anyway, getting back to the railroads, but this is all basically we reoriented from the coast to the Midwest and then the West. And several developments also indicate that the great distance of American railroads, the railroad sleeping car came in America, because most European journeys, especially at that time, were not overnight. But by this time, there were getting to be overnight journeys in America. And the guy named George Pullman developed the first sleeping car. It was big, it was expensive, but it was just a thing because In those days, people they sometimes they pull the seats together and they just sleep on their coats and whatever. Pullman had like the Pullman where the berths come down from the top and you lay them out and so on, but it was too big and too wide, so it was used for Lincoln's funeral procession from uh, 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 where he was assassinated in Washington to his home in Springfield, Illinois. And it was too wide for the railroad platforms then, so the railroad companies cut back at the great expense, I'm sure, of the railroad platforms. And when they did that, they say, well, this is a good idea. The cars are getting bigger; they're going to get bigger. So let's keep the gauge at that wider. So all platforms after that were wide enough to take the latest sleeping cars. So the sleeping cars is an American invention. Um, Understandably, because of great distance. Also, the dining car. That was another thing. These are things that made the railroad great then. And then, of course, the diners, uh, they specialized. And people going by they call it the horse and buggy age. It wasn't. It was the train age and the trolley age. And if you had a little bit of money, you could eat in a diner, and nothing could be finer than to be in Carolina having your ham and eggs. And that was the way the song went. I don't think I have it right there, but anyway. Uh, and some railroads really were known for their specialty, their pan roasted trout or their special bread pudding, things like that. But Baltimore and Ohio and Chesapeake, Ohio, were both famed for their Southern cuisine. Okay, so that's when they really boom after the Civil War. Of course, the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which made it possible. Used to be take you 2 months to cross the country by a covered wagon, ox cart, foot, whatever. Now it could do it in a week or even less than a week. Okay, so that made all the difference. A cart they figured or a wagon, if it went more than 100 miles, you ate up everything that you're carrying, the value, unless you're carrying gold or something, or it ate up the value of that wagon. The horse, the feed, whatever, the wear and tear on the wagon. So really, commerce was very, very slight in the Midwest and in the West, except for, of course, California, the port of San Francisco. Now these are connected, the East and the West. And then the railroads, well, they were booming even before that, but they took off now. And it became the biggest single industry in the United States was the railroads. And now the railroads by the late 1880s and 90s, it kind of the bloom was off. The railroads are here, but now, well, a lot of complaints they were charging too much, particularly, and that's where the populist movement starts. The farmers out in the Midwest saying that, they were charging outrageous prices, and usually it's the only railroad in the area, so you can't go anywhere else or too far away to market your grain or whatever it is you're doing there. So there's a whole movement, political movement, from which came the progressive movement. Said, well, let's reform the railroads, control them, government control. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 1893, I believe. Then the Clayton Antitrust Act, controlling railroads. Well, let's control the steel mills, and they got a monopoly. Let's control the Rockefeller oil interest. They've got a monopoly. So you can see all this starts from the abuses of the railroads, which is not unexpected, not uniquely American. I mean, you got a monopoly, you're going to charge as much as you can. A few other technological resources which changes, which were really typically American, and one was the air brakes. Trains are getting longer and longer, and the brakeman had to run along the tops of the cars and crank the brakes when he hear if the locomotive whistle like two whistles, that means get up or not get up. I mean, run along the cars and the crank the brakes. Well, that was pretty. You can imagine doing this during a blizzard or rainstorm, something like that. So the demand for air brakes under Westinghouse, I forget his first name, Westinghouse developed the air brake, which was again uniquely American. In many European countries, again, because the trains are smaller, take a shorter distance, they still have handbrakes. You notice also European trains have buffers. And what's that for? Well, because they didn't have air brakes, or also the other one, automatic couplers. The Lincoln, the pin, the knuckle couplers, as they're called, for obvious reasons. But the Europeans stuck to the Lincoln pin, which was just dropping a pin through a hole. And the buffers stop the trainmen from being crushed because you're this over here, and he's between the cars. So they rapidly developed buffers. So in all the freight and passenger in Europe, they have buffers. We do not. And it seems like there's uh, different ways of doing things. Okay. So the 1890s, the populist movement, the progressive movement, really would stem from railroad abuses and then applied to other countries. Uh, this was the great era of the railroads. 1916 was the year the railroads had I think it was 270,000 miles. Okay, that's the peak year, 1916. And then it starts to go down. It probably some of the railroads were overbuilt. Just railroads, towns that really didn't rate a railroad. They didn't have that much of a population, that type of thing. But what's also happening, of course, is the automobilization of America, the Model T Ford, especially in shorter distances. People, going from their suburbs to city would used to take the train. Of course, now they take they go by car, not entirely cars. I mean, we still have commuter railroads, but I'm saying it was a major blow. And then the stock market crash of 1920 and the ensuing depression really many railroads, I'd say almost all of them, went bankrupt one way or another. We're still functioning, but they were bankrupt. It's interesting during the depression, the bottom of the depression, President Hoover was trying to make work for the unemployed, and he actually, if you ever taken the train from New York to Washington, which it's been extended to up to Boston, that was entirely electrified. It was a major project. It's a steam railroad there, and they just electrified the whole thing with these magnificent GG1 locomotives, probably the finest electric locomotives ever made. And that was wonderful service on the Pennsylvania Railroad, even though I think it was bankrupt. They had wonderful trains running between New York and Washington, even though there are very few people. Sometimes you see some of these overnight trains, there are more railroad porters sitting around chatting than there were passengers. And somehow he survived. Now, during the war, there was a boom, of course, because tires, gasoline was hard to get, and the rationing. And so after the war, there was again the automobiles and highways. That was the in thing. Okay, railroads had lost that glamour, but the railroads did fight back. Passenger trains, they went over to streamline trains. There were some great streamliners before the war, and that helped with the depression, helped them going. But in the passenger railroads, but the after the war, another generation of streamliners came along, and they attracted a fair amount of attention, if not ridership, and the downward trend continued. Also, you have to realize that the American government, we with the progressive movement, the railroads were bad. Their exploitation big. They're very big. I mean, it's the biggest industry in the country. So we've got to regulate them. We have to have alternatives, and that would be the roads and, of course, the airports. Okay. Um, and they were often just public land where the airports, they didn't have to be taxed. Every foot of railroad property is taxed. Whereas the highways, that's from the government. I mean, the truckers pay taxes to run on them. We pay taxes for them, but the railroads pay specifically. That's private property, and the idea was, well, they're asking for it, and there just wasn't that much interest in helping the railroads. The cars, trucks, that'll take care of everything, and aviation, the wave of the future. Okay, the aviation future of America, which really hurt. And then, of course, as I say, the interstate highway system would also dealt a not a body blow, but a severe blow also. And people don't realize it's the St. Lawrence Seaway, the freight railroads. And remember, I'm talking. We always look at passenger trains. I mean, the freight. That's where the money was, and they were saying all this stuff you have the St. Lawrence Seaway built by the government. We can do it for you for no public money. If you use it, you pay for it. If you don't, you don't. And that I think they were right. Now, first, oh well, they're backward and everything. The Canadians said either you build the St. Lawrence Seaway or we'll build it and charge you tolls to use it. So it's okay, we'll go along with a partnership. But now, the St. Lawrence Seaway doesn't pay up nearly as much as it used to. And you could say in the long run, of course, in the long run, we're all dead, but still in the long run, the railroads are probably right that they could have handled that freight at not a single cost to the American taxpayer. It's the same thing as now that we are replacing, and I'm glad we are, many of our trolley lines. We call them light rail now. Um, and but they're all public, so they have to be paid out for taxes. For a lot of people, I'll never use that thing. I'm nowhere near the tracks. I'm going to drive anyway, but you still have to pay your taxes. Where in the old days it was a private company, and if you didn't use it, if you didn't use it, you didn't pay. And of course, you didn't pay that $1. I'm just saying that one nickel, which all rides pretty much were. Although there was a mayor of Philadelphia in the 1930s said 5 cents is too much to pay for a trolley ride, and he was, you elect me, and I'll reduce it. He never did, but I mean that's how. A private company, you don't use it, you don't pay for it. But we've gone so far away from that now. So the railroads are on a long decline. The passenger railroads, it was the death movement, a death decline. Freight railroads hanging in there, but still affected by a government taxation, a government policy to really hobble the railroads, and really crazy regulations like you could ship produce from Florida, but the backward trip you couldn't take anything back on the return trip. Stuff like that. That same thing also for the trucking industry. Also, they were heavily regulated. So some of these more absurd government regulations, which are not laws, they're just bureaucrats pass them whether you like it or vote for them or not, which you don't. So anyway, by the 1960s, it was really bad for the passenger railroads. In fact, the guy wrote a book called a Day Coach to Hell. The day coaches were, just sit up and, take the day coach to hell. And just how they were just going downhill. The trains were late, and the service was bad, and they weren't even clean. I mean, it was like just the demoralization. So finally, the government in 1971 developed Amtrak, put an Amtrak, which was a government-owned skeleton network of passenger trains. And it's been hanging on, but it's of course subsidized. In some years they do fairly well, in other years they don't. I remember taking an early Amtrak train somewhere in the 1970s from Washington to Philadelphia, and it was really bumpy. I mean, it wasn't. You knew this thing, and this is very bad. Of course, even the railroad, the ties that are bolted together, the clickety click wears out. Railroad wheels, so that's why they have all welded around. Now you take an Amtrak passenger train, it's just all smooth moving along. There are actually two states that don't even have any passenger rail service. I think North Dakota and Utah are completely. Look at an Amtrak map; it's not there. Although Amtrak does go over into Canada, but it's all subsidized by the government. It's never been able to make a profit. It's almost as though we felt like we got to have a passenger railroad service, even if it's very small. Every country has to have one. Although I will point out that Mexico doesn't. You say, "Oh, I took the Copper Canyon Rail in Mexico." That's a tourist railroad. But to go from, let's say, Monterey to Mexico City, you can't take a train. Regularly scheduled passenger train. I should also point out that the decline and near-death experience of the American passenger railroad was not unique to the United States. We're obsessed with cars and everything. Well, Great Britain, they were the same sort of thing. Lots of cars being made in England, and people used them, and they went on a motorway mania, the M1, the M2, the M3, and they actually had a guy, Dr. Beeching, running from a chemical company to rationalize the British railways, don't you know? And he cut a third of them. The Beeching cuts, and now this is terrible. We need these, especially in a small, a tight little island like England and Great Britain. We need the railroads, and now they're at enormous expense rebuilding these railroads. Now they're not making any money, but so all over the world where this happened, certainly I know the United States and Britain, they're trying to get back the passenger railroads. They say the freight's kind of held up. In fact, in the United States, by the 1980s, 1990s, the freight railroads of the United States were the most efficient industry in this country. I read a report that indicated that. So people are, the railroads are going down. No, not the freight railroads. But then there's not the glamour of the freight railroads. You all look at someone called the passenger railroads in America our favorite form of moving sculpture. The train goes by, people wave at it, and everything. There's very few people on it. There's still it's a choo-choo train. Uh, but the freight roads have done very well, and you can see this, the efficiency, the welded rail, and you might see a railroad cutting, and they're like a bridge with two arches over it, like for two but there's only one track there because that single track is carrying as much or more as the old two tracks used to do. You don't see a caboose anymore at the end of a freight train. All right. Um, but here's an interesting story, just how passenger railroads are just almost faded from the American psyche. At Fort Bragg, I was going on TDY, and I found out that the passenger train Amtrak was as cheap as flying, and so I went to the travel office, and they're like, "You want to take a train? What are you going to ride in the caboose or something?" And so, they said I was the only one who did that. Now it was um, longer in time, but it was much more relaxing. There was no hurry to get there. I mean, I get there and do my work, and it's very relaxing. But I was the only one in all of Fort Bragg. I mean, TDYs, there are hundreds of them probably every day, and I was the only one that took a train. It's kind of like, this is crazy. Why are you doing this anyway? Maybe that's a true story, but it might be an exaggeration for the way other people feel. I don't know. Maybe soldiers are more in a rush; they want to get there. I don't know, but so we do have Amtrak now, and they brought in new equipment, and the rails are all welded and so on, so it's much better. But it will never make a profit. So I think we can say that the railroads built this country, and they did their job, and they're still doing it. The freight railroads. Every time you get behind an 18-wheeler on a highway, and think, well, about four of those 18-wheelers would be off the road if that cargo went by train instead of by road. And of course, many things like coal and wheat and all just can't go by plane. And the box cars are obviously the most efficient by rail. Well, of course, rail, you have pipelines. So anyway, just wanted to say that the railroads and how they built this country. And thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again. This is Dr. Stanley Sandler of Stan the History Man. Bye bye.